Hello, my name is Joe Wheaton, and I'm a professor at Utah State University. And today I'm going to talk to you about BRAT, or the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, and how we can use that in planning watershed restoration projects. I want to thank Brenda Zolich from the Association of State Wetland Managers for setting this up, and BLM for hosting this forum. We'll go ahead and get started. I will say we a number of times, and there's a huge cast of characters that I should acknowledge, as well as agencies and partners that have been instrumental in helping with BRAT and pushing for its use and adoption in various places. So again, the purpose is to provide this overview of BRAT and discuss how that can be used to help with planning projects where you might want to use beaver as a restoration agent, whether that's sort of passively as shown here in the bottom, or actively through installing beaver dam analogs and hoping that beaver will take over the work for you. And we'll start by pointing out the obvious. Beaver like to make big messes, and it's these messes that we're learning is really critical to maintaining dynamism in a lot of these systems, as well as promoting better ecosystem health. And here's an example of a beaver dam complex where they turned a well-behaved little single-thread mountain channel into a big mess with a whole series of dams, split those out into multiple channels, increase the roughness of this system overall, and really its resilience to disturbance events. They help to create ponds and wetlands that provide critical habitat for fish, amphibians, small mammals. And it's really through increasing groundwater recharge and elevating those water tables with the dams that they can create those habitats as well as expand riparian areas. And fundamentally, if you think about it, what they're doing is just diversifying the residence time of everything that moves through this system. Particularly water, but also wood, sediment, nutrients, etc. And the idea of using beaver to help improve habitat is not new. This has been around since the late 1800s. Here's a nice popular example from the late 1940s from Idaho Fish and Game, where they, believe it or not, did parachute beaver into wilderness areas to improve trout habitat. And they were transplanting nuisance beaver from McCall, and they were able to do this pretty cheaply. As of late, there's been a lot of enthusiasm about beaver as a restoration tool, but one of the questions we're interested in is how do we temper that enthusiasm constructively and provide more realistic expectation management. There are some guidebooks coming out for specific types of restoration actions. For example, in our bioscience paper where we're promoting using beaver dams to restore incised streams. Some of that expectation management is coming out, but we would argue that we need to have a better handle on where is it beaver might build dams, because that's really what we're interested in. It's the dams, not the impacts. It's the dams, not the beaver themselves, that provide impacts, particularly on the connectivity of water laterally, longitudinally, etc. And so while beaver can survive in a huge range of conditions, because they are such a generalist and they just need water and wood, where they build dams is more limited, and where they can do that really varies according to flow regime and availability of dam building materials. And so we start out with what we call a beaver dam capacity model, which is all about the capacity of a riverscape to support that dam building activity. So it really resolves where and to what level within a drainage network beaver dams can be built and sustained. And so BRAT is all about how many dams you can fit, not how many beaver you can fit. And the details of this are laid out in a paper we published last year in Geomorphology that Wally led. And it's important to ask, why is it that beaver build dams? Well, where water depths aren't deep enough, they're manipulating the environment to promote deeper water so that they have cover from predators. They can swim around quickly, gracefully. They can get away from those predators. Plus, it's really important in the case of a primary dam to provide underwater entrances to their lodges. That protects their young and themselves from predators. And in areas with a hard frost, it allows them access to a food cache through the winter. So the primary questions for the capacity model that we ask is there enough water present to maintain a pond? Are enough and the right type of woody resources present to support dam building? Can they build a dam at base flows, and are those dams likely to withstand typical floods? And while we can go out in the field and address quantitatively or qualitatively any of those questions, there are some nationally available lines of evidence that we can use to provide some approximations to these. First, we can take the National Hydrologic Data Set and clip it down to the perennial extent of the drainage network, and those are areas where we know that there would be water at least available. Landfire provides a nice approximation of existing vegetation cover. And if we sample that creatively and appropriately, we can get at whether or not the woody resources are there. We can use regional curves from the USGS to get at base flow and typical high flow flow statistics, which when combined with the nationally available 10-meter DEM, which we can derive reach average slopes for, we can estimate stream power. So we have a way of leveraging freely available national data to hopefully approximate these things. And we combine these different lines of evidence with vegetation probably being the primary driver, and then these other issues of base flow stream power, typical high flows. These are used to basically limit that capacity. And then we come up with an estimate of what we think every little 250-meter reach on this drainage network could support. Here's an example from an effort funded by the Division of Wildlife Resources for the state of Utah, where we predict on just the perennial proportion of the network, something like 350,000 dams could currently be supported at full capacity. And so that comes out to about 8.3 dams per kilometer. So the way to look at this is red is suggesting that we have no capacity to support dams. So on some of these bigger main stem rivers with higher base flows, beaver just aren't going to build dams across those. Orange are rare, grading through yellow, green, and blue is pervasive. Blue is upwards of 15 to 40 dams per kilometer, so quite high densities that they will build, particularly in steeper areas with really ample vegetation resources. And so the outputs in a nutshell of this we can look at here of BRAT. So BRAT is about taking this capacity model I just showed you, running that under existing conditions. We can also, with landfire, there's an estimate of pre-European settlement historic conditions. Then we also look at the probability of conflict where beaver might cause problems by flooding roads, property, infrastructure, damaging, clogging culverts, or undesirable harvest of trees. And then we combine those into a management model. And to show you what these look like, I'm going to walk you through a little case study of how you might do this for an individual watershed restoration project. And I'm going to take you to Birch Creek in south central Utah, just outside the town of Beaver. This is actually a project with the BLM, Justin Jimenez, Dan Fletcher, and our partners in the division and others. The yellow here is showing us the BLM lands within this watershed and where we're working. And I want to walk you through how BRAT can be used in this context. So Birch Creek, similar motivations to a lot of streams and watershed restoration projects here. One of the interests is making better habitat for Bonneville cutthroat trout, and a recognition that that habitat's currently limited by a somewhat incised stream, associated with that reduced in-stream habitat complexity. Not much by way of riparian vegetation cover. There's been a lot of conifer encroachment, in this case from pinyon juniper. And beaver have been extirpated from the system. So what we'd like to use BRAT is to help us, to where and what extent is this occurring throughout the watershed, and where might beaver help us in being able to use that as a restoration tool. And so here's an output of the existing capacity model. It's based on current vegetation. Where could beaver be supported now? And we see that there are some pockets where we've got some strongholds of habitat. It turns out we can also run this same sort of model for historic conditions and get a sense, if we flip back and forth between these two, of what's been lost largely down to our land use and habitat degradation. This also provides a nice kind of upper limit on what might be possible if we're able to recover some of that. It's also important not just to look at where beaver can make a living by building dams, but to look at where they might cause some problems for humans, particularly in terms of the flooding and clogged culverts and clogging up irrigation canals, etc. And so what we're showing here is these blue areas have a low probability of conflict, and this, if you recall, is primarily where the BLM lands are. The red areas, like this little zoom in, tend to correspond to either road crossings or close to roads or land uses where there might be higher conflicts, and we see more of those down in these agricultural areas where we've got the pivot irrigation, etc. And finally, we combine all three of those lines of evidence as well as management preferences, and we can first cross off the list these red and orange areas that are unsuitable. The habitat's just limited and doesn't show much recovery potential. Then also identify what we call living with beaver areas, where you might be able to support either in low capacities or high capacities, yellow versus blue there, some beaver, but there's high potential for conflict. And so we want to identify those areas and make sure that as part of our adaptive management plan, that provisions are in place to provide mitigation if those concerns are realized. And then in pink and green and white are our sort of restoration stroke conservation zones. And the green is the low-hanging fruit, and these are the areas that could support beaver right now. And really all you need to do is get them in there. That might involve, building some starter ponds, etc. The pink are quick return, where with some relatively simple actions, maybe some BDAs or other structural additions, you could kickstart and you could make conditions better to attract beaver into those areas. Whereas the white are long-term restoration zones where the habitat is more limiting, largely usually in terms of vegetation, and so you need to get a handle on that vegetation management. Sometimes that involves getting a better handle on grazing. Other times it could be, in this case, we've got a bunch of conifer encroachment of PJ, and that's just not allowing the native riparian vegetation to get a foot in the door. So the types of restoration people do with beaver range from sort of just conservation, areas where they are, try to promote and protect, transplanting nuisance beaver from areas where they're causing problems to areas where you want them to do good, and then using beaver dam analogs to give either beaver already in an area or beaver you transplant a head start. And so there's a lot of different techniques in using these things. By far, the quicker that you can get towards passive options of letting them make the decision making, them do the maintenance if you've built structures, for example, and transferring that liability to that ecosystem engineer makes a lot of sense. Here's a nice example where once we've got a handle on grazing management and riparian resources were back in place, it was really just putting some temporary closures on harvest to allow the beaver populations to rebound in this area and them to build a bunch more dams. And that's a far easier route to go. And really, collectively, BRAT provides a set of decision support tools that allow you to assess that. I'm going to leave you with one example of where this sort of restoration really made a difference. This also comes from BLM land, this time in Oregon, where the concern was an incised and degraded stream that was limiting habitat for an ESA-listed steelhead. And we were able to see a population-level response to this sort of beaver restoration by seeing big increases in density and survival of these fish, actually some density-dependent effects with growth. Actually, growth went down, but overall that manifested itself in a production increase for those populations, not just making better habitat and them getting to choose better places, but actually seeing a population-level response. And so if we can use BRAT to identify where in the landscape it might be realistic to achieve those sorts of goals, then we think we're well on our way And so the heart of this is trying to predict what's the capacity of these riverscapes to support that dam building activity. We think we can do a pretty reasonable job of this with freely available, nationally available data sets, but the logic, you can refine this in the field or do an even better job with high resolution data if you've got it. And these outputs really, I think, help build more realistic expectations about what you can do within localized reaches, but it helps you consistently build those expectations up across large swaths of area that you manage. Finally, this is a decision support tool, and it can be even more useful when the management models are refined to reflect the management priorities in the localities and the districts that you're working. So with that, I would take questions here. And as a follow-up to BRAT, there's also resources on the BRAT website here. As a follow-up to that, there's another set of tools that we have. One of these is RCAT. It's a riparian condition assessment tool. And I'm just going to go back now. This is sort of a little tack on to the BRAT presentation, but a nice example of how you can use this stuff and show you how the valley bottom delineation, riparian vegetation departure, looking at the conversion type, the condition assessment, recovery potential, how this can dovetail with BRAT to help paint an even clearer picture of what's going on and why. BRAT's really more narrowly focused from using beaver as a restoration tool, but if you're more generally interested in sort of the riparian, the first thing you need to do is get a handle on what is the extent of the valley bottom. And so here I'm showing you an example where the green is the lateral extent of that valley bottom. And you can see where it's quite, it's quite small and narrow up through here, but there's little pockets where it widens out, etc. This is important because this sets the maximum lateral extent for your potential riparian and also for the areas that beaver might be able to directly impact through flooding. Then we can look at within that, let's compare the riparian vegetation that's there now with what was potentially there historically. And we can look at the percent departure. And what we're seeing throughout large swaths of Birch Creek here is that much of the creek has had very, very large departures from what that native vegetation might have been historically. But we can take a closer look at that and say, well, what kind? And so I mentioned already up here that a lot of what was going on was PJ, pinyon juniper conifer encroachment. And so this is getting picked up in these pinks. Down in the bottom, we're seeing these conversions to agricultural land uses. There's little tiny pockets of some development. Then there's also conversion to grass and shrubland. And so whereas the greens are the little pockets that are left over where there's negligible conversions, in this case about 23% of the drainage network. Finally, the riparian condition assessment is basically, it combines several those lines of evidence we just looked at, so the riparian departure. It also looks at land use intensity and floodplain accessibility. You may have a valley bottom that's quite large, but there's levees cutting it off or a highway or something, and so there's no longer access to this. And so what this does is it sort of goes through and says, okay, well, here's what your condition is when you combine all those things, poor, moderate, good, intact, etc. And we can see the only intact bits are these little narrow canyon sections that really just weren't accessible. We can then also take that a step further and say, okay, well, based off of the condition and based off of the current land use, what's possible? What areas have a high recovery potential versus what areas have low recovery potential here in yellow versus the areas that don't really need any recovery, they just need to be preserved. And so this can be quite helpful also for prioritizing not just beaver type restoration actions, but other types of restoration actions. And so you've got a whole suite of things here that you can use in combination with BRAT, RCAT, the repair and recovery potential, etc. And this can help prioritize planning. And I'd just like to emphasize again that these products can be derived with freely available national data sets. Lastly, snowpack is a big issue. A little odd here in Utah this year. We've had such amazing snowpacks that it doesn't. It's easy to forget this, but the norm is shifting from most of our precipitation in these mountainous areas coming in the form of snow to projected, and this is being realized in a lot of places. Even this year, with really large snowpacks up high, we are seeing much more of our precipitation come in the form of rain and mixed rain snow. And so we've taken BRAT and we've used a variety of other models to estimate how much water storage could be held back in surface water storage in the ponds themselves in beaver dams versus in groundwater storage within those groundwater volumes, how much increase in that. And so here's some estimates based off of 5% of the capacity of the drainage network to support dams, 25, 50, 100%. So this is, the sort of best case scenario potentially, and some estimates of what sort of groundwater and surface water storage you could get. And so that can be quite a useful tool. This can be looked at in different ways. Some people might look at this as quite a positive thing. Others might, downstream water rights holders might look at this in a negative light. Either way, what it does is it provides a basis for looking at how much storage we're really talking about. Is it a drop in the bucket not to be worried about? It's not even a measurable impact. Or is it something that, locally you get so many dams that you could, here's an example of what this looks like in a little area, that you might be meaningfully increasing base flows by storing that water, holding on to it longer like snowpack does, and slowly releasing that out over the summer months. So those are some games that you can play and things that might also be of use. And with that, I will I'll end this presentation, and we'll just have this posted for folks that might be interested in hearing it again. Take care.